Hello everyone and welcome to the final video for the final 3 elite specializations from End of Dragons. And now that we've had some time to play it, I have decided to go back and do a bit more of an in-depth review. So for this episode, we have the light armor professions. Now let's start with the necrotic alchemist, the Harbinger. This elite specialization is a gun-wielding, potion-throwing, and acrobatic fighter that bombards foes with conditions. Thematically, the Harbinger is doing a lot, but it does it in enough of a convincing way to not make it a glaring issue. The pistol offers up a mid-range condition damage playstyle, which conveniently has access to some powerful CC effects, and the pistol is overall a solid weapon on this new spec. The new utility type available to the Harbinger are the elixirs. Aside from the icons of the elixirs, the fantasy of throwing them at your foes to corrode them fits the necromancer super well. There is a part of my heart that longs for the beta version of the elixirs where they were purely buff skills when not in Shroud. But maybe to change it a little bit, perhaps if you were in Shroud, they then became attack versions, with the Shroud acting as a distant cousin to the engineer's toolkit. But I digress, that was an idea that I had a long time ago. And for the profession mechanic, they receive the Harbinger Shroud and Blight. Now I'm going to first dive into Blight as it's incredibly unique. This new self-debuff reduces your vitality, and it's a really cool concept for the necromancer, but felt more respectable during the beta testing. Now Blight feels more of a tacked-on mechanic that is really easy to forget about. Shroud skills and elixirs are also able to remove Blight from yourself, which makes it even less of a mechanic to keep track of and be fearful of. And when it comes to the Shroud and its skills, it doesn't make much sense that the Harbinger Shroud itself would be shedding Blight. I can see how the fantasy of the elixirs could, curing that Blight, but the Shroud? No, Mary. The Shroud feels fantastic though, but I just wish the skills stacked up Blight on you more fiercely and rewarded you more for having higher stacks of Blight without removing it. Now let's head into the traits. My overall score for these traits is a 6 out of 9. The Adept and Master tiers function well and feel unique, but once you get to the Grandmasters, it feels like the spec runs out of juice and imagination. Every single Grandmaster trait does the same effect. It's a pulsing circle around you while in Shroud every 3 seconds, but depending on the trait you take, it just does a different effect. With the history of the quality that's been brought on these elite specs, my expectations are so much higher than this, so any changes to this formula would be a better change in my opinion. Now, here are some of my own suggestions, and because I want to drastically redesign these are extremely wild suggestions, but let's get into it. So first and foremost, we have cascading corruption. Now, I also changed the name of this, as corruption is oftentimes indicative of condition damage, but it's actually the power trait, so I've just renamed this to cascading doom. Your power is increased, leaving this the same. Leaving Harbinger Shroud at a Blight threshold unleashes Cascading Doom, a unique attack. And Cascading Doom detonates after a brief delay, damaging foes and applying inhibiting conditions in a growing area. I would like a trait, especially for a Grandmaster, to change the visuals a little bit, add to it a bit more, and inform the player differently on how they're going to interact with that Blight. And I think rewarding the player for being at higher stacks of Blight is more of an incentive and more of a cool, unique playstyle that hasn't been toyed around with all too much on the Harbinger, or perhaps not nearly as much as I would like. And the next Grandmaster trait would be Corruption Approaches instead of Doom Approaches. Your condition damage is increased, leaving that the same, but adding the new skill fact of, while in Harbinger Shroud, Blight's threshold can surpass the normal maximum. Passing thresholds of Blight pulses out a cone of conditions. Currently, you can only stack up 25 stacks of Blight on yourself, but what if you had a trait that actually increased that total maximum, making it more deadly to sit in for longer, but also rewarding you while you continue to stack up that blight. There are also other traits in the spec that reward you for being at higher stacks. So I find this to be a very interesting glass cannon option and leaning more so into that condition playstyle. So blight threshold would be at 35 instead of 25, and every time you gain 5 stacks of blight, so at 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, you would quickly burst out a cone of torment and poison in front of you. 2 different ideas that might need a bit more explanation because the traits for the Harbinger are just not it. But despite the traits, I do enjoy the Shroud, I do enjoy the pistol, and also the elixirs. Now, moving on to the next spec, we have the Virtuoso. Now, this psionic dancer, hell, it's just the Virtuoso. Remember how I said the Harbinger's themes seem to just barely make sense and feel fine? Well, the Virtuoso is that spec that just feels like it's taken a step over that line and feels like too much. With so many themes floating around with its skills, utilities, and traits, I have not felt a solid identity from this spec. Nevertheless, let's get into the weapon. The main hand dagger is a cool new ranged weapon for the spec, but awkwardly has more effect when you play it close to medium range. The abilities don't allow you to play as comfortably at range as I feel you should be able to play at. You have to get up really close for your second ability, and you have to awkwardly plan out your third ability so that it passes just in the middle of its overall travel time. It's just a bit finicky. Now, it's a fun weapon, but I would find a lot more comfort with the weapon if at least the third ability was more stationary and honored where you wanted to have the effect at. And the utilities are known as psionic abilities and offer a great amount of strike damage to the spec. All in all, I really enjoy these utility skills. Now, to note, all of these utility skills and even the dagger skills count as blades, and these blades interact with various traits, but we'll get to those traits shortly. And when it comes to the shatters for the Mesmer, they are transformed into blade songs and can activate with 5 illusionary blades up. These blade songs feel weighty and are the first shatters that come with cast times. I really love the fantasy of being a spell-throwing Mesmer where the shatters become more physical spells, and the Virtuoso nails that down perfectly. Now let's dive into the traits. The bottom line of the traits transform all of your blade skills into conditioned skills, applying bleeds on hit. Now, at the time of the beta, I was very resistant to this idea of bringing condition on this spec, as we just came from the Mirage, a very Condi-focused elite spec. I was also resistant as Condi usually pushes out strike damage builds, as the damage just keeps on rolling even if you're not activating abilities. However, looking at the Virtuoso more closely and seeing that it doesn't offer any aggressive boons to be shared to allies in the form of, say, quickness, might, and fury, its role really does feel like a pure DPS. So I've warmed up to the idea of having this flexibility. Now, strike damage builds do feel like they could use just a bit more assistance here and there, particularly with the traits of the Virtuoso. Here are some of my thoughts around the traits. First up is a trait where, if you've been on this channel, you might have heard me mention this, and I'm still a little agitated by this trait. It's mental focus. Currently, this just increases your damage by 10% if you are in melee range or mid-range of 600, but on a spec that is so long-range focused and having that access to 1200 range, it's bewildering that this trait doesn't also enhance your ranged damage. So what I would like to see is to have this scale dynamically based on your range, where your minimum damage increase is 10%, but if you happen to be at further distances, you can get up to 15%. So overall, you're still going to be getting that damage boost that you want in melee combat, but if you're playing it ranged, you're just going to be getting a little extra love. And just to have this even apply to that 10% at range would be good enough, but I really find this trait to be sad. And then next up, we have a Grandmaster, Infinite Forge. Infinite Forge is one of the weaker Grandmasters that Virtuoso has access to. I wanted to just give this a little bit extra love, and this might be a bit powerful, but screw it. Stock blades faster while in combat. This would be the same. You'd be generating blades every 3 seconds instead of every 10 seconds. But after using a blade song, you would gain the infinite forge buff for a duration based on the number of blades used. So if you use 5 blades, you get this buff for 5 seconds. This buff would increase your ferocity and also allow any application of vulnerability to deal a packet of damage, rewarding you for applying vulnerability even if your target is at maximum stacks of 25 vuln. Vuln is a condition that can easily get to maximum stacks with little effort, so just giving a little extra reward would feel sweet. Those are my 2 trait suggestions, and overall Virtuoso is one of my favorite elite specs if I'm being fully transparent. I just tend to be a little agitated by the lack of identity that Virtuoso has in terms of its themes, but in gameplay, it's a lot of fun. Wrapping this up, we have the Catalyst. The Catalyst was probably in one of the worst spots during the betas, but has since grown to be a fair pick. This spec's fantasy did, and still does, not really speak to me in a way that I would like an Ellie elite spec to feel. With an Ellie getting a hammer, I would have appreciated the hammer to be a ranged weapon, subverting that expectation of how a hammer is used. But nevertheless, the Catalyst gets a hammer. Much like the Untamed, the Catalyst does a hammer very well. The use of weaving ranged attunements with fire and air, with melee attunements of water and earth, does play to the fantasy a little bit, but feels more so half-baked, literally. Now, despite the majority of the kit being strong, the third ability on the hammer is shared between each of the attunements, and I still cannot get behind this. It feels too much like a profession mechanic on a weapon, while also having its own profession mechanic in the form of the Jade Spheres. Also, those orbs of rewarding you for swapping attunements feels so much more fitting on something like a Weaver on their elite skill Weave Self, but I digress. I would still love to see each attunement get its own unique skill 3 for the hammer that assists in that attunement's ranged playstyle, and I made some of those as well. First up, we have Fire. We have Flame Wheel. Conveniently, I left the name the same. This would send out a wheel of flames, striking foes and returning to you, striking foes again. This would look like Vapor Blade, but just on fire and really hot. I also wanted this to have a little bit extra range of 900 to just separate itself from the other abilities and make it more of a standout. Next, Water Attunement. I feel that Water Attunement is missing some CC, as it is a very melee attunement. We have Downpour. Call down a ring of rushing waters, knocking down foes close to you. This would deal decent damage and just do a very quick 1-second knockdown applying vulnerability, and just as an added benefit, maybe this grants you resolution or vigor or some regen, something to the imagination. Next, for air, as this is a ranged attunement, I've come up with Jolting Zap. Conjure a small conduit at a location. This conduit will strike one foe at a time. So this would be an area of attack, but instead of doing it to multiple enemies, this would pinpoint one over its duration and strike them and would change targets. And the next up, we have one of my favorites, Earth. I think Earth could really shine on Catalyst if it was given a little bit extra stuff. We have the third ability that I've made, Mud Mantle Strike. Strike your foe with a mantle of mud. Create a burst behind your struck foe, dealing extra/more damage. This attack would damage and grant you barrier if you are successful, and in PvE, the first target hit would be taunted and slowed, and anyone else who is behind them would receive less of an attack, but also be slowed as well. So a little bit of area of effect application, but really focusing in on that taunt for PvE only. I would not want to see taunt come into the competitive modes. So those are my suggestions for the hammer specifically, but let's continue on with the rest of the kit. We have the utility skills of augments. Augments feel much better since the beta incarnation, but they still feel fairly stance-like, where it's a personal enhancement to your character, but all in all, they're fine. Now for the mechanic of the Jade Sphere. The Jade Sphere has had some controversial changes in the form of removing its base quickness from air attunement. You now must take a trait to give the air sphere quickness. Now I go back and forth with this decision. On one hand, I enjoy when they grant the spec defining boons to other areas aside from the traits, but I also understand how this was a bit of an issue with the level of damage that catalysts were pumping out. So all in all, I'm indifferent to this change. I think it's fine. Now, speaking of the traits, let's get into these. I appreciate how simple and pure these traits are for the catalyst. They don't come with a paragraph, and instead focus on one area of combat or a role you're looking to fill, and tries to do it to the best of its ability. Now, despite my admiration for these traits and the purity of purpose, I do have a few suggestions with the role of the catalyst and the role that it's looking to fill. Let's first talk about hardened auras. This will reduce your damage and give you a stacking buff each time you apply an aura to yourself. This is your adept tier, and one thing that I noticed is that you only have one trait in this tier that generates energy. So I've basically just introduced energy generation on the other two. So for hardened auras, this would grant yourself energy when you give yourself an aura. In the same vein, we have Vicious Empowerment. This currently gives you Elemental Empowerment and Might when you disable or immobilize a foe. I've decided to get rid of the Might and instead grant Energy. So gain Elemental Empowerment and Energy when you disable or immobilize a foe. I feel that having more access to that energy on this tier of Adepts would make each choice a little bit more worthwhile, rather than you always taking like the energized trait where swapping attunements gives you vigor or fury, is it, and energy. And then next, and I believe finally, I have a change or a recommendation to staunch auras. I love the simplicity of this. Gain stability when you gain an aura. But I also think that there could be some group application of this, just to allow Catalyst to play that bruiser role, that quote-unquote tank role, of allowing your allies to persist in combat with enhanced defenses. What if granting yourself an aura shared stability around you? Now, this wouldn't be on any aura that you get from like a Tempest. This would be totally self-controlled, where you have to be actively applying those auras to yourself, granting your own character that 3 seconds of stability, but having an added benefit of sharing some stability to allies around you in a fairly generous radius. I think this would probably be a very interesting Grandmaster, see some extra play even in PvE zones, PvE settings where there is a lot of crowd control. I believe that is it, everyone, for the Catalyst. It's on a journey. It's still on a journey, but it's much better from where it used to be at during the betas, and I'm overall very happy with the progress that they've made on all of these elite specializations. And in this video, we covered the Harbinger, Virtuoso, and Catalyst. Thank you all so very much for coming on by. This has been a really fun retrospective, and if you want to catch the other videos for medium armor and heavy armor, I will have those on screen at the end. Thank you all so very much for coming on by. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to all the YouTube stuff. If you'd like to get early access to these videos, head on over to the Patreon, and I stream over on Twitch every day of the week. If you are interested in Guild Wars 2 or trying it for free, I also have links below. Thanks, ArenaNet, I appreciate you. And I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye, everyone. Mwah.